Hi everyone, this is a video on removing the intake plenum on an N57S engine. So that's for the BMW 740D. The model here is a 2009 engine, the F01 series. So there's quite a few YouTube videos out there for the N57 and how to remove the intake manifold. And BMW have an online guide which anyone can really download and follow. But I found that for the N57S, there are a few unique bits and pieces that need doing. So I thought it worth recording a video for anyone else out there who's trying to do the job on the 740D and getting stuck like I was. Now, apologies in advance, I'm not a regular YouTuber, so the quality of the video and, let's say, my narration might not be up to the usual standards, but I'll give it a go. So to start off with, I've already removed the engine cover and the intake, the air intake housing. I'm assuming you're already familiar with that. It's quite an easy job to do. It takes about 30 seconds. Once you've taken that off, you're more or less presented with this view. It looks quite busy and everything looks pretty compact, and that's most BMW engines in my experience. And just to give you an indication, when I started off doing this job, I was a complete newbie. I'm tech savvy, but I wouldn't say I've had much experience with BMW engines, but I've learnt a lot along the way. So yep, definitely if you're looking to do this job, my advice would be to download the guide from BMW. It lists a number of preliminary tasks. Definitely, first thing you should do is disconnect the battery terminal over in the boot. Reason for that is, as I understand it, if either on purpose or by accident you end up turning on the ignition and somehow trying to start the engine, the glow plugs will still be active, and if your intake manifold's half off or completely off, you're likely to get some flames coming out the intake ports. The other reason for that is you don't really want to mess around with metal things falling into or touching the alternator. So yeah, best to do that job first. Again, that's relatively easy, so I've not covered that here. It's just a case of getting into your boot compartment and taking off the terminal. So the next thing it lists here is to remove the pressure pipe at the throttle body. So once you've taken the ducting for the air intake off, pressure pipes here. Again, this is quite an easy job. You can see there's a clamp there. What you'll need to do, because this is actually disconnected, but once it's connected, what you do is you push the pressure pipe that way, and you'll see that part of the clamp come into this little window here. If you take a flathead screwdriver and pull upwards, the clamp pops out of place, and you can pull the pressure pipe backwards and off. It's a two-handed job, but you get what I mean. So the second thing the next step that the guide says to do is to disconnect the plug connection at the throttle controller. So that is this connection down here. Now this connection is wrapped up under the throttle housing down there, so you can do that in this step, or you can leave it till a little bit later. It just depends how comfortable you feel, how much space you've got to move around, but yeah, that's one step to take. What the guide then says to do is to disconnect the plug connection at the charge pressure sensor. Now that's really easy, so I'll show you that in a second, but actually my advice is, for anyone looking to do this job, there's a lot of electrical connectors that you need to remove. And as you can see, if you remove the electrical connection at the throttle body here, there's these other connections hanging onto it. So these need to be taken off as well. And they're the ones that slot into this connector here. And they can be a bit tricky to do. And the reason I'm saying to do this first is, what I found was, it's an absolute minefield. There's so many electrical connectors that if you can't take them off or they break for whatever reason, I'd arguably say you can't actually do the job. So it's best to get this sort of stuff out of the way. And the same applies when you look around the rest of the engine bay. Get all your electrical bits and pieces out of the way. This is just held in by 1, 2 screws there. This is the the alternator cable. That's just clipped into place here. That's easy to remove, that's easy to remove. But actually this doesn't wiggle that much until you start to undo electrical connectors, and there's one screw there. And then as you can see, there's even more electrical connectors. This one here goes into the swell flap controller there. There's one down there, but that wasn't necessary to remove. You might find that you need to do that. And then this wire here, there's an electrical connector there. You don't need to undo the electrical connector, but there's like a lug that it's held onto there. And I just found it was a good idea to take it off that lug again, just so it was easier to lift this off there. Otherwise it was really quite restrictive for space. The next thing I'd recommend to do is this pipe here for the Egr it's Egr Bypass Duct, or pipe, sorry. So this pipe runs from down here all the way up through here and connects down to here, where the bypass air is pushed back into the intake manifold and comes back up that way. And there's that part of it there goes back into the cylinder head. So this is actually something that I found pretty impossible to start off with. The BMW guide recommends that you remove it, but it makes out like it's actually a really easy job. And if you talk to some mechanics and other people who've removed the intake manifold in N57, they say that actually removing this isn't necessary. I tried that, but again, arguably on the N57S, there's just not enough space to wiggle this part of the intake manifold off, unless you remove this. But what was stopping me removing it is, if we look down here, there's 2 bolts that go through there. 1, 2. They go through here, and you can probably just about make out on the video how rusted that connection is there. And in fact, I'll show you one of the bolts. You can see how awful condition that is in. Those bolts would not budge at all. I put copious amounts of WD-40 and other sprays on there. Then I came to the understanding that actually they're no good because they are lubrication sprays. But I tried everything I could think of. Those bolts wouldn't budge. I even ended up putting the whole car back together and taking it to a mechanic. The mechanic straight away, he said, yep, I'll give it a go. And as he started to make the bolt move, you could hear it creaking, and the bolt was about to snap. So again, I was completely stuck, because there was no way I was getting the intake manifold off without removing that pipe. So after doing a bit of research, I came across this stuff. Kano Aerocroil. Not cheap, cost about £23. Got it off the internet, but absolutely fantastic. I sprayed this on those bolts down there, and within, I'd say 2 to 3 minutes, both of them came loose. That is no exaggeration, this stuff is absolute magic. So once you've been able to get that pipe off, and bearing in mind I've taken it off here, but there's a Jubilee clamp there. You undo the Jubilee clamp, you undo that bolt, and then the 2 down there that I mentioned. Once you've been able to get that pipe off, it'll make life a lot easier for you. Then going back to the guide, again, the guide says to remove the charge pressure sensor. That's this one here. A lot of people incorrectly call it the mass airflow sensor. It's not that, it's a charge pressure sensor. After that, it's relatively straightforward for a while. The intake manifold itself has got 7 bolts. You can see one there, and there's one over there. They're really well spotted on the guide. They're easy to find, they're easy to access, and those bolts don't fall out. They stay within the intake manifold, so you've got no risk of losing them. What I would recommend is that you follow the guide in terms of the sequence of taking the bolts off. That's quite important. After that, the guide then says to remove the intake plenum lock. This is an absolute pain to find, to access and to take off. But where it's actually located is back here on the underside of the intake manifold. It's in a really inaccessible location. But before you even try and get to that, you won't be able to lift the intake manifold off to get access to it unless you take the plug connection out of here, and more importantly, you remove the screw from the dipstick holder here. Both of those are secured to the intake manifold, and there's no way you're getting it off before you take those off. So then once you've done all of that, you might find, as I did, that for some reason it's still not budging, it's still not moving. One of the reasons I found for that was because if you go back to this Egr pipe system here, that side of the pipe which goes into the cylinder head just seemed to be stuck in place. I kind of guessed that there's a gasket on the end of it, and because of all the heat and the age of the car, it had never been touched before. It must have just somehow bonded into place. And a really good tip from a guy on Facebook who said it's actually a good idea to undo these two bolts here, prise it off a little bit, and then give it a good pull from there. That actually seemed to work. I think it was held in tension somehow. So undoing these two bolts, prising it and pull, and it took it off the cylinder head. I then found that actually this makes for a really good grip because it's quite an awkward size and shape, so I put the bolts back in. So then you're more or less ready to start pulling it out. One thing to be aware of again, I'll go back to the electrical connectors here. If you follow the wiring, you'll find that some of the wiring is clamped onto the intake manifold. There's one little clamp there, but it's important to follow this wiring down here as well, because some of it can get in the way. And there's another clamp just around there. There's another clamp there, apologies, not great camera work, which clips onto a flange on the oil filter housing. Again, undo those clamps because they're going to get in the way for when you try and lift the intake manifold off. The BMW guide says to remove the plug at the oil pressure switch. Now I'm not sure exactly where that is. I would hedge my bets and say it's down there if I follow this electrical wire. But as you can see, there's another 2-3 steps that you need to do to even access it. It's an absolute nightmare. So I left that well alone, and luckily enough I was able to actually get the intake manifold off. So the next step after that is to start to pull the intake manifold up so you can access the plug connection at the back that I mentioned, the lock that's attached to the intake valve. And you should be able to access that by now. So if you pull up from here, the intake manifold lifts up, and I'll put links to the pictures of what that lock looks like. But essentially it sits again on there's a bit like a square recess flange or lug back here, and it's the same type of locking mechanism that's used on this plug here. So it slots into a metal piece. You've got to lift up that tab and then slide it to get it off. But that's not the end of it for the N57. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take this off. I'll have to pause the video. I'll take it off and I'll restart the video and I'll show you what that looks like underneath. Okay, so this is going to be a bit tricky because I'm holding it one-handed. But if you can just see, this is with the intake manifold being held in the air. You can just see that's the underside of the back part of the intake manifold that I mentioned. There's that little lug. There it is. I'll show you in a second what hooks onto that. But also here's the kicker. This vacuum hose is unique to the N57S. This is also attached and will prevent you from lifting the intake manifold off in its entirety. and it's really incredibly frustrating because you think you've done everything, you go to pull it off and there's just something holding you back, but you can't quite tell because it's in such an awkward position. Now, don't do what I did. I got frustrated and I started twiddling here and trying to pull it off there. I then went back to the BMW guide and realised that actually they do mention it for the N57S, albeit in true BMW fashion it's a pretty crap explanation. But there's a T-junction which I'll show you, a T-junction for the vacuum hoses, and you're meant to pull it off of there. So I'll just pause again, take this out of here and show you what I'm talking about. Okay, so here you are with the intake manifold removed. If we go down here, this thing there, that is what is white on the BMW guide. The lock that's attached, the valve, sorry, that's attached to the intake manifold. In fact, I'll pull out the guide here. This stupid thing. And just to make life harder for everyone, they've shown the picture upside down, so you've no bloody clue what you're actually meant to do with it. But there it is. And that vacuum hose that I just showed you hanging off the intake manifold, that attaches to this T-junction down here. Can you see? So you're meant to put your fingers either side of the T connection so you don't break it, and then I found it was easiest to twist like that and pull, twist and pull, and there you have it. And that should really be all it takes. He says all it takes. It took me several weeks of non-stop trying to actually figure out how to do it on this engine. But yeah, once you do it, it's a good feeling. It's an absolute pain, but you save yourself a lot of trouble doing it yourself rather than taking it to a mechanic and being charged 4 hours labour or whatever it is that they want to charge these days. But it's an incredibly messy job, so yep, make sure that you've got appropriate gloves and a good supply of them, because there's all kinds of sharp ends of cables and bits of plastic and metal all around this engine bay, and I found that the gloves just kept splitting, so you need a good supply of them as well. So then, before I show you what my intake looks like, and I haven't cleaned it yet, I'll show you the reason why I'm doing it. I also just wanted to give you a view of what my intake ports look like, and it doesn't make for particularly good viewing. You can see there, I mean that should all be metal. You should be able to see the valve. Apologies again, not the best video, but you should be able to see metal and the valve seat there, and you just can't. And there's all this leaves and crap that I'm not going to touch right now. I don't want them to fall into the intake itself. But yeah, that doesn't make for great viewing. So yeah, as I said, you know, I'm not a regular YouTuber. This isn't the best video in the world, but hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea as to what it needs to take the intake manifold off an N57S. Happy to try and help out anyone who's doing it and getting stuck, so leave a comment and I'll do what I can. And then just to finish off, here's what it looks like when you take the intake manifold off, as in here's the connection to the intake ports. So you can see that, look at all that gunk sitting on the swirl flaps. It's terrible. Then if you look at this side, this is the swirl flap motor there. I kept getting fault codes about the swirl flap positioning being wrong. Now that could just be down to the gunk, it could be spurious fault codes, but I would hedge my bets that it is both down to the gunk and the fact that I think this is the thing that actually moves, connected to the swirl flap motor here is the actuator which connected to the rod, connects to the swirl flaps. That seems quite gunked up for some reason. So whether this part of the gasket's been leaking and crud has just somehow accumulated there, I don't know. But also just worth showing you inside here. So this is the anti-Giada valve, I think, to be exact. Most people call it the throttle body. But behind the throttle body, you can see, if I can get it to focus, you can see how much carbon's been building up back there. And that's as a result of it coming back out through the Egr pipe, as I mentioned. So all that will be coming apart, and I'll be cleaning it.